Hello, welcome to Reader's Labyrinth. I'm Frank, your host. If you could, please like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe. This encourages the YouTube gods to put the labyrinth on people's radar, and it really helps this channel to grow. You might get the impression that I only interview authors of horror, and although I enjoy the genre, it really wasn't my first passion as a reader. I started off with a love of Eastern Mediterranean history. That's why I'm excited to introduce for you Eileen Stephenson, author and amateur historian of one of the most fascinating and largely forgotten topics in the West, the Byzantine Empire. With her Imperial Passions series, short stories, and nonfiction works, Eileen has beautifully painted for us a portrait of characters driven by all the familiar motives: fear, greed, lust for power, love of family, and a burning desire to rise above one's social rank. What you're getting when you buy one of her books is a window into one of history's most unique civilizations, and one that is very much alive today in the politics of modern Greece, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Serbia. Some say that while visiting Mount Athos in Greece, just before sunrise, there is a presence hovering above the misty mountains, gliding along the ghostly chants emanating from the Orthodox monastery, and that you can hear the jostling bones of the Byzantine Empire, hungering for the fallen city of Constantinople. So, please join me as we step back in time for just a bit and chat with Eileen Stephenson. As always, I hope you will spare a few minutes to check out Eileen's website and links to her books. I also invite you to buy her books and leave her a review. You'll find all you need in the show notes. I hope you enjoy our chat as much as I did. And now, let's get on with it. Eileen Stephenson, welcome to Reader's Labyrinth.
Thank you, Frank. I'm glad to be here, enjoying this conversation with you. It'll be great.
It certainly will. So before we get into the weeds of it, I have to ask you, as a history fan, as someone who's read up on the Byzantine Empire, when do you think the Roman Empire fell? 1453
Absolutely.
or 410?
1453.
I am right there with you. I was hoping you were going to say it.
Of course. I mean, 410, that's kind of a squishy year. Other people would say later in the 5th century, but really it was 1453. But no,
I have to agree with that sentiment.
Yeah, it was a sad year. Every year, the people on Byzantine Twitter and Byzantine Facebook, we mourn the day in May that the Turks finally conquered them. It's a sad day, but all good things have to come to an end, right? Unfortunately.
And the Byzantine Empire had one heck of a run too. I mean, one heck of a run.
Centuries.
What? I mean, it lasted 11 centuries. Well, so here's a follow-up question. Do you think that Sultan Mehmed II, whose forces stormed the Theodosian walls, I think, of Constantinople and took the city?
Yes.
Do you think he legitimately assumed the title of Roman Emperor after he conquered it? Because he used that for the rest of his life. And I think the last Ottoman Sultan to use it would have been Murad I in like the 18th century or something. But apparently in the Middle East, it carried a lot of weight. But I understand that in Europe, not so much. But
not so much in Europe. I think there are historical rumors that the Turkish sultans had married Byzantine women from the imperial family, and maybe they are counting that from that aspect, which is certainly a possibility. And by the time the last Turkish ruler resigned 100 or so years ago, they had every generation, they had chosen many times their spouses to be non-Turkish. So by the time the last one came along, they were probably just as Greek or even Russian as somebody from that, that part of the world was. But they did like to say that they were the Sultan of Rum. So that was, they did have some claim, but not really a valid one, in my opinion.
And for me, and I don't know if you share the sentiment as well, but it seems like one of the hallmarks of the Byzantine Empire was its orthodoxy. I mean, the Eastern Orthodox Church. So, how could you claim to be the Byzantine Emperor, if you're not an Orthodox? I mean, that would be like the Latin kingdoms that came and, yeah.
Right. Absolutely. That was, I think, a lot of the reluctance of anybody to ever accept them other than their own Turkish, peoples. So
definitely.
People I think it was only in their own minds that they were. I think they had some claim, but as long as they weren't Orthodox, I don't think anybody else would have accepted it. And that was
Isn't that fascinating, though? Oh, yeah. Although there were a couple of sultans who kind of flirted with Orthodoxy, I think. But of course, there would have been dire consequences for themselves and the family. But
absolutely,
the hold of the Roman Empire, the continuation of the Roman Empire in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, it's amazing the hold on the imagination we all have. And so I was wondering, what is it about the Byzantine Empire that so fascinates you, Eileen? And how long have you had this interest?
When I was growing up in school, Byzantine history was, you might get a paragraph or two in a history book in a general overview course, but not much. And my first real exposure to it was I happened to pick up an audiobook, The Short History of Byzantium by John Julius Norwich. And it was I was working some distance from home, and I listened to audiobooks all the time. And one week I just couldn't find anything at the library other than this one. And so I started to listen to it, and the first bit of it was an introduction. And the author says at the very end of the introduction, there are many things you can say about the Byzantines, but boring is not one of them. And I kind of rolled my eyes at that and laughed, really, what the heck? What are you talking about? And by the end of the book, I was completely taken with the Byzantines. It's like ever since then, I've just tried to find more and more books to read about them, study more about them, see many places that have Byzantine history. So that was how I got into it. And it was in this century. But it just started out small and mushroomed over time.
Kind of like the empire itself. It started off small, and over time it just grew and grew and grew, didn't it?
Right.
You write historical fiction, and I have found that to be a very niche genre, and I've always considered its authors especially gifted and insightful. Are there any events in your life which influenced you in a profound way that made you choose historical fiction as your writing?
It was just something I was attracted to, even from my youngest age. I enjoyed history. The very first chapter book I read as a child, as I recall, was historical fiction about some settlers in the U.S. And I found it very engrossing. And I think part of it is I like trying to figure out why things happened in the world, what brought the world into the shape that it is today. And history and historical fiction typically would be an entry point for me as something I would then go to history books to read more about, to get the real story. I would start out reading a novel of, the Tudors, the Roman Empire, French, whatever. And so I would start out with a novel, and then I'd go and read the history. Well, so it started out this time with reading the history first. And then I went to look for the fiction, and especially about the 11th century, which I found most interesting. And there was not much. There's a lot of historical fiction related to the Crusades, but it is generally from the point of view of Western Europeans coming in, and it has the same view of the Byzantines that Edward Gibbon had, which was basically they're a bunch of sneaky dogs that you can't trust for anything. There is some good historical fiction that takes place during the reign of Theodora and Justinian in the 5th century, but that particular era is full of a lot of drama that is hard to beat. So I could see why there's so much about them. But the rest of the time, and the Byzantines have 11 centuries of some pretty amazing stuff going on, and people aren't writing about it. So I thought to myself, well, it's a niche I need to fill.
You see, this is something I really, really appreciate. And this is what I like about, in a lot of ways, the new media age that we live in, is you can see that there's a gap that, hey, you know what? Nobody's writing historical fiction about 11th century Byzantine Empire. And I love how you identified it and you went into it. And, I had a sneaking suspicion that historical fiction and an interest in the past is something that you probably carried around with you since you were,
6 or 7 years old.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. 7 years old. And I can remember being, 7 or 8 years old and having a fascination with history in general. So I can definitely see where you're coming from on that. Now, who are your favorite contemporary fiction or nonfiction authors out there right now?
Now, in terms of contemporary, you mean today, writers from today?
Yes, ma'am.
Modern day writers. Okay. Well,
yes, ma'am.
In terms of sort of relaxation books, Leanne Moriarty, she tells a great story.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I also have enjoyed the thrillers that Steve Barry writes. That he writes modern times thrillers, but they have a huge foundation in history, and he has his characters working around historical mysteries and things that happened and maybe didn't happen. Or there's one book he has about when it had to do with the Smithsonian, and it also had to do with how the income tax system was initiated in this country, which I had no idea there were some scurrilous goings on about that. His one book I found fascinating also was The Bishop's Pawn, about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And that was pretty interesting. But in terms of nonfiction, I really don't read anything or much of anything that is nonfiction that isn't history. Because really, why bother? I have a boatload of books. I like Tom Holland's. Yeah, I have Tom Holland's books. Rubicon was very good about Julius Caesar, and he's quite good. And John Julius Norwich, who passed away a couple of years ago, all of his books are really, he's just a superb writer. So I can recommend any of those anytime.
Well, that sounds great. And most of the authors who you mentioned, I believe that they have books on tape too. So the folks out there who are driving and you can't read whenever you're driving, you can certainly find them.
Oh, yes.
So I was just,
and that's how I listen to them
I was
most.
wondering,
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. And another growing realm of history that, if anyone is interested, is podcast. I mean, I subscribe to about a dozen history podcasts, and they range all these different topics and time periods, because the genre of
Mm-hmm.
history is so large. I mean, you could spend your entire life in just one little narrow area, but there's some really, really cool stuff floating around out there. And I could definitely make some recommendations towards the end of this.
Right. Yeah, that would be
So
great.
who else in the family? So who else in the family are as passionate about history as you are?
Well, my husband, but we have different eras. He loves Civil War history. He's
Oh,
attended a
okay.
number of reenactments up in Gettysburg, and visited a few Civil War sites. My youngest daughter also is very interested in history, although she tends to focus more on Roman history, the main Roman Empire in the West. So, yeah, it's I'm sort of alone in the Byzantine world myself.
Kind of like the Byzantines found themselves in the 12th
Right,
century and 13th centuries on, kind of alone, yeah, facing the world.
right, right.
So I would kind of like to get into historical fiction, the genre, and also kind of discuss the general history of the Byzantine Empire itself for some of our viewers that may be unfamiliar with it. So these next set of questions are going to kind of delve into that, just so we can kind of make that mental gear shift, I suppose.
Okay.
So for me, the appeal of historical fiction is that it's very much akin, and this may seem strange to some of our viewers, but it's very similar to science fiction in that tons and tons of research goes into the making of these stories. So what's your research methodology like for your historical fiction?
Um, well, first of all, I think it's interesting you should make it sound like it's similar to science fiction, and I think it is. When I was a kid growing up, I liked science fiction and I liked historical fiction. I've sort of gotten away from science fiction, but uh, it's just maybe it's just sort of a little bit escapism. But in terms of my methodology, well, so how I started writing my first novel was I was, occasionally you get bored at work, and I would start kind of surfing the internet and looking for history on the Byzantines. And then I found this one woman who was profiled in a number of places, in Wikipedia and other places, Anna Dalassena, who was the mother of Alexis I Comnenus, the emperor. And I started reading her life, and I felt like somebody had just kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, "This is who you need to write about. These are the people you need to write about." So I started writing about. That's what I did. I started researching it, and it's taken a lot of work because you can't always find the information you need in one source. Fortunately for me, the Byzantines were highly literate. Literacy was at a time when Western Europe nobility was often illiterate. The Byzantines were literate down into the middle classes. People could read and write, and did. So the Byzantines had a number of historians that were covering the period. Some excellent, excellent historians who were in the right place at the right time, and around the emperors who were making these decisions. And I was able to piece together a good story based on the historians that were from those times. And so a lot of it was at first just reading these sources and making sure that I got different perspectives on what was going on, because everybody has their point of view, and some of them were favorable to the people I was looking at as my heroes, and others were not as favorable. But that was really how I started with it. And I try to go to original sources as much as possible. And as I said, there were three main historians that were around for the first few books that I wrote. And the one I'm working on right now has the main character's daughter, who's written a history of his reign. So I have tried to do it that way, basically putting together the story based on my view of the characters and taking a good view of the people who were living then and what they were writing, but not taking it 100%, because they all have their biases just as much as anybody today does.
So I really like the part where you're discussing how you use primary sources, because, I have seen in in the genre of historical fiction, some of the writing kind of suffers from, well, this isn't a jab at some of the historical fiction that only uses your secondary sources. But if you can get into the primary source material, I mean, especially if you have some proficiency, if, either in the language or you've got a really, really good translation of it, then you can kind of get into the skin of these historical people and just really kind of figure out what makes them tick. And
Right.
so you mentioned that, yeah. So you mentioned that you use three kind of official Byzantine historical sources for this. And this kind of leads into the next question, because another similarity that I've seen to science fiction is historical fiction often has some hardcore history buffs in tow. And let me tell you, if you've ever been in the comment section of YouTube, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. But any departure from historical facts or established narratives, I found that good authors of historical fiction, they can present this to their readers in such a way as to reconcile any differences as a result of artistic license. So what I'm wondering is, how do you tackle this in your book? Has this ever been an issue? And what do you say to someone who would ask why you presented a person, place, or event in Byzantine history in a way that cuts against any official histories?
I haven't actually run into that problem yet. I really do try to stay very close to the historical record, at least with how the story goes. But I don't want to be dogmatic about it. Everybody can have a different view of where the story is going, of how motivations behind what people did. So I can, I'm not really wedded to my version of it. I've read enough historical fiction over the years to understand that one person's point of view is not necessarily the same as anybody else's. But at the same time, I have worked really hard to stay as close to the historical record as possible. And fortunately, the three primary sources that I have used in the first two novels were pretty consistent. I mean, they had different opinions about motivations. They had different opinions about some of the emperors and what they were doing. But yeah, I can have very different opinions about some of these rulers. but I pretty much stick to historical facts. I'm not trying to make stuff up in my novels that is definitely not accurate. So I do pretty much stay with the record, but it's history is just so much full of a lot of stuff going on, and a lot of different people have different opinions about it. Fortunately, I would say the historical records for the Byzantine era in this period are consistent about the actual events, if not the motivations and reasons for why things were done.
It would be really, really funny if you added some historical falsehoods into your work, like just kind of, and someone found it and they were like, no, you don't understand. Emperor Justinian, he escaped and he actually wasn't and just some crazy, I think we could have the beginnings of a funny conspiracy theory in Byzantine.
Yeah, we could.
Byzantine history. We could start up right here. Yeah, we could.
We could.
I realize in retrospect that I probably should have asked this question as number one instead of asking when you thought the Roman Empire fell. But truth be told, I'm kind of a history nerd. I mean, I could talk about the Byzantine Emperor, probably for most of the night, just going down all kind of different rabbit holes. So, Eileen, can you please provide us a brief history, very, very brief, of the Byzantine Empire?
All right. So the Emperor Diocletian in around the year 300 decided he could not manage the whole empire by himself. So he had two sub-emperors. And there was a Western emperor who was headquartered in Milan. They had moved the capital from Rome to Milan. And then an Eastern emperor who was initially headquartered in Nicomedia, which is in Anatolia, Turkey, just across from where Constantinople was. Eventually, the Constantine the Great wrested control over the whole Roman Empire later on in the 4th century. And he moved his eastern capital, to Constantinople. And he made it his eastern capital. The western capital remained in Milan, but he was still in charge of the whole thing. Constantinople, of course, is now Istanbul. The Byzantine Empire, with the capital in Constantinople, lasted for 11 centuries until 1453, when the Turkish Sultan conquered it. And so it lasted over 11 centuries. And I have a few lists of the things that the Byzantines did before the rest of us did that you probably don't realize. Okay. For one thing, they were the first ones to establish hospitals. There were no hospitals before the Byzantine Empire. They had female physicians at a time when that just was not common. They were the first ones to develop dinner forks. They were highly literate, down into the middle classes. It wasn't just the upper classes who were literate, all the way down. They established the first universities. They didn't have quite the staying power of the University of Bologna or the University of Paris, but they had universities. The first female historian was the granddaughter of Anna Dalassena, Anna Komnena. They developed Greek fire, which was kind of an early version of napalm. And I don't know if they invented it or not, but they did some industrial espionage. They sent some monks to China to bring back the secret of silk. And this happened in the reign of Justinian and Theodora. Theodora sent these monks to China, and a few years later they returned with silkworms, and they began having their own homegrown silk industry. They were the first ones to establish orphanages. It was a massively huge charity that they had in Constantinople. It was the main charity of the emperor, and nobody had ever had orphanages before the Byzantines. And hospitals they were small. They weren't the big operations like we see now. Generally, they would only have a few patients, but they were established by wealthy citizens, and they were the first hospitals ever. So those are some of the things that the Byzantines did first. Then the empire finally fell in 1453 to Sultan Murad II, and but it had been severely damaged in 1204, 1205 by the Fourth Crusade that came from the West. That instead of crusading against the Turks and the Muslims in the Holy Land, they saw a richer plum that was unfortunately riven at that point by internal conflicts and rivalries in the leadership of Constantinople. And that was, it pretty much went down from there in 1205, after 1205. But it still dragged on for another 250 years. So that's a very brief overview. There are so many interesting people in the Byzantine Empire. And I can't even, I just happened upon the 11th century and haven't looked back.
So, do you think, in your opinion, that the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople, do you think that was kind of the killing blow to the empire? Had that not happened, do you think they could have instituted military reforms that could have, had an effective response to the Seljuk and later Ottoman Turks?
Yes, the Fourth Crusade was a killing blow, but they had made themselves weak so that it was easier to kill them. A lot of internal rivalries, poor leadership, people who were more interested in money than they were in taking care of their empire. Obviously there were going to be some people who were good and not completely corrupt, but unfortunately at the top of the heap were some pretty weak and or corrupt people. And I'm not sure I'll ever get around to writing about them because I don't think it would be a lot of fun.
Yeah. So my next question is about the Crusades, and setting aside some of the later Crusades that were instituted against the Ottoman Empire, like the Crusade of Varna, the Crusade of Nicopolis, that was an obvious attempt to provide some form of military relief for the Byzantines. What's your opinion of the Crusades? Do you think the Crusades, well, the Fourth Crusade aside, that was obviously, a killing blow. But do you think the Crusades managed to buy the empire some breathing space, or did the Byzantines really kind of lose control of their geopolitical destiny because of the Crusades? Just what are your thoughts on that? If you have any kind of opinion on it.
I don't think they lost control. I think it actually helped them, at least initially, to regain a lot of the territory that they had lost because of mismanagement in the 11th century, earlier in the middle decades of the 11th century. And they regained control over a large part of the Anatolia area. And until the Battle of Myriokephalon in it's 1260 or something, and that was just, it was an emperor who had become a little too self-assured and didn't realize that he needed to be a little bit better prepared. But that's when I was still working, I worked in banking, and I can tell you, as a lender in banking, you often one very big trope in banking is the first generation founds a company, the second generation works hard for it, and the third generation messes up. And in the case of the emperor at the time, my character, that I'm writing about now, Alexis Comnenus, he was the progenitor, the father of this group. His son John was also very good. His grandson Manuel, not so good. Although he put on a good show, but he didn't take his responsibilities as seriously as he probably should have. So, but
that's kind of the same thing that happened to the Mongols too. Yeah.
Yes.
Go on.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Genghis Khan, and then his grandson Kublai Khan, and then after that it was, downhill from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially the Byzantine Empire. Like, whenever I was studying the history, I used to think that the emperors being, not knocked off one after another was a bad thing. And I mean, it really was, especially when you get like past the 1300s. But I suppose in some way, hey, they're bringing in some new blood, literally bringing in some new blood. And I was going to ask as well. So my study of the Byzantine Empire kind of came from when I was doing my History of the Ottoman Empire podcast. So I kind of would encounter the Byzantines from their perspective. But one thing I kept reading about is, instead of executing an emperor, like, they would like pour boiling like vinegar into their eyes to blind them. And I kept seeing all these footnotes, like there would be a pretender to, the throne of Constantinople. He would lose some kind of power struggle and they'd blind him. So, and this is off topic, I guess, but where did that practice come from? Why did they do it? I guess, or is that just, kind of how the Byzantines, we won't really know.
Well, I think it was because they felt that it was a less cruel treatment of somebody than killing them. And so that's why they did it, because they were Christians. They weren't going to be killing the previous emperor. As a rule, it sometimes still happened, but as a rule, they would blind you or send you to a monastery. But that they felt that this was a less cruel treatment than killing you. Unfortunately, there were more than a few times that they were not as careful in how they managed the blinding. They used to, I guess they had different ways of doing it, but in the 11th century that I'm writing about, what they would do is they would put a hot poker up to the eye. Wouldn't necessarily touch your eyeball, but it would be so hot and burning that it would,
oh my gosh,
cause blinding. But at the same time, if you were writhing around trying to avoid the hot poker would often get on the actual eyeball, and then
it'd get in your eye. Oh man!
And it would get infected, and then you would die within a month or so of that experience. People who were who had the self-control to not try to escape and wriggle around and move their head could survive it, but I'm not sure surviving as a blind person is that much better than dying from it.
I mean, not only surviving as a blind person, but surviving as a deposed member of the imperial family in Constantinople with all that stuff going on. Well, that seems like, right. Oh man, oh gosh, that's terrible. But
pretty bad.
Well, at least, yeah, and at least in my opinion, I guess being a man is like, so the Ottoman Turks, when they would get an itch to assassinate a sultan, if he was a prince, then they could use a bowstring and strangle him to death. But if he was a sitting sultan, then they would execute him by compression of the testicles. So I don't know what it is about that part of the world, but there's all these footnotes on how these sultans have been executed. Yeah.
Well, I knew about the bowstring on the princes.
I suppose that's why they would raise an army. What's that? What's that? I'm sorry.
I knew about the bowstring, but I missed that other part. I'm glad I'm sticking with it with the Byzantines. They did not do that.
Yeah. At least not before 1453, but
right.
So your writing is taking place in the 11th century, right? Mm-hmm. So do you think that you're going to stay in the 11th century, or are you going to go before or after that, or what's your future writing going to look like?
My future writing is going to be, I'm working right now on my next book. I'm about a third of the way done with it. It's going to be on the reign of Anna Dalassena's son, Alexis I Comnenus, who was if I have a hero in my history reading, I would have to say he's it. He took the throne. He was the empire was being assaulted by the Turks from the east, by another group, the Pechenegs, from the northeast, and by Robert Guiscard and the Normans from the west. And he managed to wrest back control of a large part of the empire during his reign. He basically spent his whole reign as a soldier, and he was just, I just find his energy, his intelligence, and his judgment about a lot of things to be really, really it's just very bright. And I just think he's a very admirable character in history. So I'm working on the first book, which will take us up to from 1081, when he takes the throne, to 1092, or maybe 93, because there's so much that happens during his reign and all the efforts that he had to put in. He basically had to go around and conquer and push back invaders from every corner of the empire, and did a pretty darn good job of it with very few resources. So just a really admirable character for me.
So on that note, and this is a question that just kind of floated into my mind, just listening to you talk about his military campaigns. When I think about the Roman Empire, I'm thinking of, the legion, I guess, is the standard unit of, the unit that would be on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. When we talk about the Byzantine Empire, what did their military look like? Now, I imagine it must have gone through so many different stages, depending on the ebb and flow of the empire, its fortunes as a whole. But, what do you think a typical Byzantine army would have looked like? What would it have been composed of? I mean, were they regular soldiers? Were they militia? Were they mercenaries? Or what did it look like?
All of the above. All of the above. They had a core group of elite soldiers based in Constantinople, and then they had militia in each of their jurisdictions. It was kind of like a state system, but they were, so each little jurisdiction had its own, kind of like the National Guard, and they had certain tax benefits for people who served in the Guard and received rights to use certain properties to be a farmer, but you'd be eligible to be called up. And these soldiers were, they were like a National Guard or militia. But then the professionals were based in Constantinople. There was also a navy, and there were armies based more in Anatolia and some more in the Greece and Bulgarian area. They were, and they also hired mercenaries when they needed them. The character that I'm writing about now, Alexis Comnenus, he takes advantage of, he's fighting at this point in the book, the Normans, who have, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but the Normans, they didn't just go and conquer England. A lot of them went down to Italy and took over, especially southern Italy, and conquered that, and Sicily. And they ruled there for a few hundred years. Didn't last as long as they did in England, but they made a big
I had
impact.
No clue. Yeah, I had no clue about that. Yeah, wow.
Yes. So, and this one Norman adventurer, Robert Guiscard, he was particularly adventurous, and just he decided he had been a soldier of fortune, came down to Italy, ended up the Duke of most of the southern third of Italy, running that whole area, and then he decided, I think I'd like to conquer the Byzantine Empire. I mean, at that point he was in his 60s, and he was still, quite energetic, and hoped to make one of his sons the Byzantine emperor. But that's when Alexis decided, no, I'm emperor, not you.
Yeah.
And he pushed them back. It wasn't easy. It was definitely not easy. But he ended up hiring some of those Norman. Robert Guiscard was, in fact, originally from Normandy and then came down to Italy as a mercenary, and had a lot of his buddies who came down as well. And when Alexis pushes out the Normans from Greece, he actually ends up recruiting some of them to come work for him. And he also recruited Turks to work for him at times.
That's a shrewd man. Oh, yeah.
Yes. And he managed to...
the enemy of my friend is my friend.
Yes. Yeah. And he did a pretty good job. What he accomplished was nothing short of a miracle, because the empire had been very strong in 1025 when the Emperor Basil II died. But then it was just one bad emperor after another, except for two decent ones who unfortunately didn't last that long. One of them was his uncle, Isaac Comnenus, who I think you were going to ask me about. And Isaac was quite a soldier. And he was the only Byzantine emperor on his coins, he's showing himself with a sword raised as a soldier, because he'd been a soldier for so long.
Okay, yeah.
He
Earned
was,
it.
yeah, he was very good.
Earned that coin,
but
yeah.
He was, he had a few unfortunate incidents after reigning for almost 3 years, and then abdicated because he had, I think he was actually struck by lightning,
Oh my
and
gosh! Wow.
and
Yeah.
survived it, but felt himself incapacitated, and just felt like he couldn't do it anymore. And
Can
he
you
he
imagine? Can you imagine for a second the palace gossip that must have happened when he was struck by lightning, especially
Mhm.
for the Byzantines back then? I
Right.
can only yeah. That's an omen, a
And
sign from above. Yeah.
yes, well, that's how he took it, unfortunately.
Hmm. Oh,
And uh,
okay.
but he was actually, if he had lasted longer, I think the whole trajectory of the empire would have been very different than what it was. So, but instead we got his nephew, who did become Emperor Alexis and was quite outstanding, as was Alexis's son John. So,
It's really amazing how the whole trajectory of the history can be changed by just one little event, and it just spirals out of control. It just leads to one thing to another and to another.
mm-hmm. Right.
So, so I'd like to talk a little bit about your books finally. now that we've kind of covered some Byzantine ground. So you wrote a series, Imperial Passions,
Mm-hmm.
and it's set in the 11th century.
Right.
What I'd like to know is, and I think we kind of talked about this, but what is it about the 11th century specifically which appeals to you?
Well, part of it is the trajectory of the empire. In 1025, when the Emperor Basil II died, the empire was incredibly wealthy, very secure borders, just an amazing entity, very strong in every way, except for one. The Emperor Basil II did a very poor job of succession planning. He had a younger brother who succeeded him. His younger brother was dissolute. He only lasted a few years, but he had two daughters who succeeded him. First was Zoe, who was frivolous, to say the least, married 3 times, which was not a good thing in the Greek Orthodox religion, and married some pretty dissolute individuals as well. So there was that, and so it went from a peak in 1025 when Basil II died to, by the time Alexis takes the throne in 1081, we're talking 50 some years later, the empire is being attacked by the Turks, by this other Central Asian tribe called the Pechenegs from the northeast, and from the west by the Normans. They had absolutely no secure borders. The treasury was broke after decades of dissolute rulers who spent money on nothing that was benefiting the empire. And he had to pull it all together after that. So it was interesting. And then I think what really got me was when I started reading about Anna Dalassena, who is Alexis's mother. And I was reading, there are pages and pages on Wikipedia and other sources about her and her life. For a medieval Byzantine woman to have that much information about her and herself and her life and her family was kind of amazing. And then the more I was reading about her, I'd always kind of had an interest in writing historical fiction. I wasn't sure there was any money in it. There really isn't. I'll just tell you, writing historical fiction for most of us is not going to be a winning lottery ticket. But I'd always had an interest in it. And when I started reading about her life, I thought, this is the person I need to write about. It was like somebody tapped me on the shoulder. This is who you need to write about. And her son, Alexis, was I have to say, if I have a historical crush on anybody, I would say it's on him. But
There we
he's,
go. I figured it out.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But his mother was quite a remarkable woman. I mean, I keep wondering, what was it about her? She was just an upper class woman, but not particularly wealthy. How she managed to position herself and her family so close to the throne that her son could take it is really kind of amazing to me.
But if you think about it, isn't that the story of history itself? I mean, you have these powerful, cunning, really, really intelligent women, and they're on an Einstein level of understanding human emotional, like the politics and interactions that would go into an imperial court. I mean, I can think of examples from the old Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. Don't even get me started on the Ottoman Empire. My gosh, Sultan Mehmed II. I mean, Sultan Suleiman. Yeah, I mean, they are case studies. I mean, just made in the image of their mothers. And like these powerful women had an ability to read people. Like they could almost read your thoughts. And they're always thinking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps ahead of everybody else. And you keep seeing this over and over and over again in history. It's really, really an amazing thing. I mean, I really enjoy it. I think it's fascinating.
Some women are like that, and you don't really see that. I mean, there are some interesting women in the Roman Empire, the old Roman Empire, but they don't really ever. There aren't any rulers in the old Roman Empire. There are female rulers in the Byzantine Empire, and some of them took the throne themselves. Justinian and his wife Theodora. Theodora was basically considered the co-ruler with her husband, and she had started out life as a courtesan. There's a number of. There's one woman who blinded her son, and who was the emperor, and took the throne for herself, which was kind of an unusual way to treat your son, but
super hardcore, yeah.
Yeah. But there really were only female rulers in the Byzantine Empire. They really didn't have many before that. There aren't a lot in the Byzantine Empire, but there are definitely some. And Anna Dalassena was never an empress or anything, but she was basically, her son was out fighting wars, basically for 15 years after he took the throne. And she was left behind to handle the running of the empire otherwise. So while she was never an empress, she was the mother of the emperor, and she was pretty much in charge. So those it is interesting to me to see how I really started to wonder about how she started to think of herself in that kind of a powerful position, or how she got herself into a position where she would have that kind of influence to get her son or help her son become emperor. But she did it, and that's how that's how my 2 novels are so far. And now I'm working on the next novel about Alexis.
Well, that's awesome. That is really, really incredible. And for the next question, I was going to ask about your character, Isaac the First, and is that Comnenus? How do you pronounce his last name?
Comnenus. Well, I call him Comnenus.
Comnenus.
He was Anna Dalassena's brother-in-law. Her own husband. So this was a very famous scene in in history. So Isaac he was the one who was hit by lightning, and he's resigning, he's abdicating. And apparently he offered the throne to Anna's husband, John, and he turned it down. And apparently there was a bit of a scene between them after that when he turned it down. Between Anna and her husband John, and but Isaac was the only emperor that I'm aware of who had himself crowned in the ambo, or the pulpit, at the Hagia Sophia. He's the only one whose coin shows him with a raised sword. His wife was Bulgarian, the daughter of the Bulgarian emperor that had been conquered and brought back to Constantinople. And he was also a scholar. After he retired from being emperor, he wrote some books on poetry. So, kind of an interesting character.
So whenever he abdicated the throne, what did he do? Did he become a monk? Did he become a scholar? Did he just try and stay? Okay. He
became a monk. That was the typical routine that you would, if you were to retire, you would get a tonsure and go enter a monastery. And a lot of monasteries were built by the nobility and by the imperial family, and they were kind of like it was not a particularly hard life. Usually, they had the comforts of some of the luxuries that they had grown used to. They didn't necessarily have to live an ascetic life. They could live a pretty comfortable. It was more like a retirement home for the wealthy, if you established one of these places. But some of these monasteries were really serious places. They one that Anna's grandson, the Emperor John, founded was a monastery. It was also a hospital. They had a very large hospital there that actually specialized in eye diseases for some reason. And there was a church, of course, a big church. And that church is still there. It's a mosque now, but I visited it, and I wasn't able to get in because they were undergoing renovations, but you can see pictures of it. The Pantokrator Monastery. So the monastery that Isaac went to was one of the largest monasteries in Constantinople for hundreds of years, called St. John's Studian. And the ruins of the old church that went with it are still there. They're not accessible. I know other people who have tried to get in there, but they don't let them in. I guess it's a little dangerous. The walls keep sort of crumbling down a bit.
So I wonder if you're going to tell us about those Facebook pages that you're a part of, where we can learn about how to get into the forbidden parts of the old church.
Oh.
So, yeah. I'm sure there's some stories that are floating around.
There are a lot of Roman and Byzantine history Facebook groups, and I have joined every one I can. There's always something new going on.
That's awesome. I love that. Yeah.
Yes. The one I joined first is actually called Roman and Byzantine History. And it was started by this kid he was like 17, 18 years old when he started it, living in England, in a not that large of a town in the western part of the country, Scott, and he just loved the history, and so we started it. And I was like, I was kind of feeling like, there's really nobody I know who's really interested in Byzantine history. I I was kind of alone, and it was like finding this group of other people who found this history interesting was amazing. I loved it. And I started going to, there's a place in DC called Dumbarton Oaks that has a large Byzantine history museum.
That's incredible. Okay.
Yeah, it's not really large. I mean, the size of it is a corner, a small corner of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which also has a nice Byzantine collection. But I'm lucky to have Dumbarton Oaks close by. Unfortunately, they've been closed for most of the time since COVID hit, but maybe they'll start opening up more soon.
Well, that's awesome. I'm really glad that you found a group. I know whenever I started podcasting, I found the hashtag history pod group on Twitter, and really, really enjoyed it, because I was finally able to nerd out in some of these conversations and talk about source material. I was in hog heaven, as we say here in the South, hog heaven all day.
Right. And Twitter has a lot of active people on Byzantine Twitter too. I'm one of them.
Yes, it does. Oh yeah, yes. So I was going to say, I've seen the hashtag Byzantine history floating around a whole lot, and I'll see some stuff trending from time to time on it. So there's definitely an active community on that. In which, if our viewers, if you guys are tracking, I will have Eileen, her Twitter handle in the show notes, as well as a link to all of her books, her website, and everything. So you can just click on down there and get it. So before I let you go, I would like to ask, can you tell us real briefly about the role of women in the Byzantine Empire? Now, you've already shared with us that a whole lot of folks in the Byzantine Empire were highly educated, which would explain a whole lot of things, because I'm having some, questions I had about Byzantine history that's actually been explained to me, as I've been listening to you. And one of the things I've always wondered about, and now I'm going down a rabbit hole, please feel free to stop me, Eileen, if you need to, because I can just go and go. But I was listening to a podcast about the Phobius schism that was going on in Constantinople and Rome at the time in the 8th or 9th century. I can't remember. And one of the hosts of that podcast said, one of the papal legates that went to Constantinople, he sent a dispatch back to Rome and said, look, everyone on the street knows about this controversy that's brewing. And he said, I was buying milk from this person and they were asking me about it when they saw that I was from Rome. My servant was trying to trade a donkey, and the person driving the donkey was going in about the about the different clauses in the councils. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's it. And he says, everyone in this freaking city, from the emperor, and he says to the pauper, and he goes, they are educated and they know what's going on. So what you said there, it really kind of struck me, because I'm like, well, that's it. I guess, if everyone can read and they're following all of this stuff and they're tracking with it, I guess they, it completely sheds a different light than what I had before you were speaking of about the people of the Byzantine Empire. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah, they were pretty well educated, and they had the hippodrome for sports, but I think their real interest was always going to be religion. They loved to argue about religion, and that was just one of the things that they're known about. So.
They were Facebook and Twitter before there was Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah, really. They were tweeting.
Oh, yeah. But this papal legate, and the host of this podcast, they were reading from it. He was really impressed with the depth of their knowledge, and their knowledge of languages, their knowledge of just, canon law. I mean, and they followed, imperial politics really, really closely. I mean, it's a really fascinating time. So. Anyway, I just thought that was totally cool.
It is. It's amazing how intelligent and educated they were at a time when in Western Europe, you might have a few monks who knew how to read and priests and the like, but most of the royalty didn't, bother to learn how to read. So it was it's amazing that they were able to hold on to civilization so well over all those centuries.
So, have you ever had a chance to travel to the Eastern Mediterranean region, to go to Greece, to go to Turkey, Bulgaria? Okay, you're shaking your head.
I have not been to Bulgaria. I've been to Turkey twice. I've spent maybe 3 or 4 weeks there.
I can think of a city that you may have visited. I can think of a city where you've been.
Yes,
yes, that's right.
And a truly amazing place. I mean, there's interesting things all over, interesting history all over Turkey. You can't really walk down a street without stumbling over something historical, and it's wonderful. Greece has a fair number of interesting places to visit that have Byzantine history in them. But, what's really interesting is to go to Italy and see there's a lot of Byzantine history in Italy. For example, the city of Ravenna, which is not easy to get to, but it's really worth a visit, has 8 UNESCO World Heritage Sites there. And they are exceptional. I've spent several days there now, and it's amazing. And then there is also Venice. So a lot of what you'll see in Venice, in the Doge's Palace and St. Mark's and other places in Venice came from Constantinople in the 4th Crusade. Are we frozen, Frank?
Let's see here. I am getting you just fine. I'm not seeing any kind of issues on here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm frozen on my screen here, but as long as you're fine, I'm not going to worry about it. But yeah, Venice is a great place to see Byzantine art, and the horses on top of St. Mark's came from Constantinople. Many of the pillars, the mosaics, that's all Byzantine. So you can see a lot of Byzantine history in Italy as well as in Constantinople and other places.
Man, that's fascinating. Wow.
Yeah.
me and my wife were talking. We have a bucket list. We definitely would like to start in Istanbul, Turkey. I would like to see the old cathedral, Hagia Sophia. I would love to see that, definitely at least once in my life, just go see it. And
it's
see
amazing.
the Golden Horn. Oh yeah. And at least in my heart, it's always going to be Constantinople. At least for that.
Mine too.
And see the sun come over. Yeah. And now this would be an interesting historical aside. A lot of the Ottoman sources, they listed the city as Constantinople up until like 1918, 1919.
Right.
And it really wasn't until the Turkish Republic was established that Istanbul really became like the official stamp on the city after that, because they were really proud of their city. They wanted it to be known that they lived in Constantinople, the center of the world at the time.
Well, Istanbul is kind of a nickname for Constantinople. It was the old Greek way of saying, go to the city. And it kind of slurred into Istanbul. Yeah. And so, right, a lot of us Byzantine history fans are adamant that it's still Constantinople, but Istanbul is really it's just more of a nickname. It's kind of like saying instead of saying New York, you say the Big Apple.
That's a fascinating bit of history, because I wonder as the centuries as they rolled on, if people just kind of forgot that, and if Istanbul just kind of stuck whenever the empire was destroyed, and it became the Turkish Republic. But that's some fascinating stuff.
I think it was
What do you
Kemal
think? Yeah.
Ataturk who changed it. I think people had just been
Okay.
calling
Yeah.
it that casually, and they just changed it to be the official name. I
Well,
don't
there
know
we
for
go.
sure. Yeah.
With bitter irony, the Turks are trying to keep the memory alive. How about that?
Yep.
I doubt
Yep.
it, but yeah.
Oh, one
So
thing.
I have a question. Oh yeah, sure. What? Yeah.
One thing. So you can see in the background here, this little plaque I have at the back.
Okay. Yeah.
The blue with the stars on it. Let me see if I can go
Yes,
get
ma'am.
it for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Bring it closer.
Please do.
This is a copy of part of a mosaic from one of the World Heritage sites in Ravenna.
Okay. Yeah.
One of my writer friends had a class. She writes about medieval Italy, and so she had a class on mosaics in Ravenna. And so I saw this and I thought, oh, it's my birthday. I think I need to get that for my birthday. But Ravenna is so worth a trip. So worth a trip if you can get a chance to go there.
It sounds like it, and that mosaic is beautiful. I love how the blue will pop out of it. Was blue a common color for the Byzantine Empire, or blue purplish? I guess
the blue color was very valuable, especially since a lot of it came from lapis, and I guess it was just lapis that they used for the blue color. I don't believe that's what mine is made of, but and your question again was about the blue color. Oh, okay. So
yeah, the colors. I didn't know if there was like a significance to it, or
I think this was supposed to be a picture of stars in the night sky. And so that's why they use that color blue. And there's the mausoleum of Galla Placidia in Ravenna that has a similar star, gold stars on a dark blue background. But this particular kind of stars on a blue background comes from, I believe, the St. Andrew Chapel in the Archiepiscopal Museum, which is in walking distance of Galla Placidia's. But they're both, they're very similar. The one thing I would say is, one thing I've learned is that the mosaics in Ravenna are very early Byzantine, and you don't find those in Istanbul because during the Byzantine Empire, there was this issue with iconoclasm, and the emperors decided that was just getting to be too much like paganism, so they destroyed all the icons. So all those early icons that were in Constantinople were destroyed. Well, by that time, Ravenna had pretty much broken away from the Byzantine Empire. So those were all preserved. So all those early mosaics from the Byzantine era, you can really only see what they looked like in Ravenna. And pretty much just Ravenna, because everything else was torn down. Destroyed.
That's so ironic too. I mean, the only place that, you can see the early, the iconography would be Italy, as opposed to the old Byzantine lands. I mean, especially after the 1254 split, I imagine that's some pretty incredible stuff right there. Well, so what do you have in store for your, oh yeah, sorry. Go, please continue. Oh, no. Oh, you sure? It sounded like you had a thought that was trying to get out, and I strangled the thought before.
No, I'm fine. I just chatter on about the Byzantines too much.
I could too. Let me tell you what, I could probably talk for most of the night about it, especially once my mind kind of gets fired off on it. But unfortunately, I don't have all night, and I would love to keep on going.
Yeah.
But this is why I like to introduce my readers to guests that I would like to have on again one day. So you are certainly invited to come back on, Eileen. But before
Thank you,
I get you
Frank.
out of here, one more question for you. Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you for coming on. I really, really appreciate it. And I could chat about, Eastern Mediterranean history for hours and hours. And it's taken my brain a little bit to warm up tonight because I've been kind of going without sleep. But my question for you is, what do you have in store for your readers in the future? Do you have any work in progress right now? Is there going to be a book release next year? What have you got for us?
I'm working on my next book, and the tentative title is The Glory and the Kingship, and it's going to be covering the first 11 or 12 years of the reign of Alexis I Comnenus. So basically 1081 to 1092-93. And because there's a lot, he reigned for 35 years and I have a lot to cover. And so he was very busy during that time. So I think it's going to take at least 2, maybe 3 books for him. So, and I'm about a third of the way through it right now.
Okay, awesome. And it sounds like another series then is going to be coming out for us.
Yep.
Really excited about that. Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, Eileen, thank you for stepping in. Oh yeah. And I'm sure our viewers are excited as well. I know I've been it seems like of late I've been on a binge of interviewing, a bunch of authors of horror in the horror genre. But I will tell you this, there's a lot of crossover with history. A lot of those authors of the works, I mean, if you mention the Byzantine Empire, they're going to know exactly what you're talking about. So I'm pretty sure that, there's going to be some crossover on that. But thank you so much for coming on my show, Reader's Labyrinth. I really, really appreciate you, Eileen.
Thank you for the invitation, Frank. I appreciate it. Anything to get out the word about the Byzantines. They don't get enough press.
Their memory will never die, will it?
Not with me.
That's right.